Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, good afternoon. I'm Charlotte Kahn. I'm a journalist and moderator, and I am delighted and honored to welcome you this afternoon to what would be undoubtedly an engaging and a sharp conversation with one of the most influential communicators and political strategists in modern British history, journalist, author and former Director of Communications to Prime Minister Tony Blair, Mr. Alastair Campbell. And please join me in welcoming Mr. Campbell very warmly. So Mr. Campbell, from Downing Street to best-selling books and now host of one of the world's most downloaded political podcasts, you have made a career of asking and answering, importantly, big questions. So today at the Astana International Forum, a platform for global dialogue in an era of division, we're going to be putting some to you, of course, and ask you, what happens when politics becomes theatre? When truth bends to narrative? What future for democracy and what role, of course, for the UK and for Europe in this great reshuffling of power in the world? And how do you best influence in today's world? So here's my first question to you. Yesterday in his opening address, President Tokayev talked about a world at crossroads, a world at an inflection point. And it's hard to disagree, of course, given the geopolitical, environmental, technological and demographic upheaval. So do you share that diagnosis? What's your assessment of this great reshuffling, this great shift in power in today's world?
Well, thank you. There's a lot in that. Thank you for having me. I do share that analysis. I think that it's possible to make the case that we're living through a period where the pace of change is greater than it's ever been. And I don't think any of us can confidently predict how that change is going to play out. I don't think that so I left Downing Street in 2003. Tony Blair left a few years later. I don't think you could have predicted at that point that the world would be in the geopolitical state that it's in now. You certainly wouldn't have predicted, for example, that we would leave the European Union, an act of national self-harm. I don't think you'd have predicted that Trump would win once, let alone twice. And I think you wouldn't necessarily have predicted, or maybe you would have predicted, the extent to which China has become such a big power. And then I think underlying it all, and maybe it's the one thing that I've not heard that much about here, is the whole climate crisis going on too. So I think there's demographic shift and migration shifts. These are all playing into an agenda that suggests this is a really troubling and troubled period in history.
Hence the next question, what role for the UK and for Europe in this new distribution of power, this shift maybe from Atlantic to Pacific as well? And I mean, what does Europe stand for in this world? And what about other rising superpowers? I'm thinking of India, for instance, and middle powers like Kazakhstan, our host today.
Well, so I grew up kind of through the Cold War, and you had a sense of this sort of ideological, spiritual, moral, political fight going on between East and West. And the conventional wisdom was that the West won, okay? And the famous Francis Fukuyama end of history, even though he says it's been misinterpreted, that feeling about that period of history. And I would argue that since then, I think one of the reasons why the United States is going through such a strange phase right now is I wonder whether deep down, psychologically, they already, even though they don't want to admit it, there's a sort of acceptance that maybe they're not the most powerful country in the world anymore. So they're the two superpowers, China and the States. And then you have others, as you say, like India, that may develop in that way. What role does Europe have? The reason why I say that I think Brexit was an act of national self-harm is because I think Europe is the only other body of political values and ideological opinion that can ever get even close to the levels of power economic, military and every other way you want to think of it, and cultural, of China and the States. So I'm still very, very confident about Europe. I'm less confident because of what we did. But it's very interesting to see how, even with Britain now, the UK now out of Europe, in relation to Ukraine, for example, and I thought it was very interesting. I wasn't here yesterday, but I had reported back to me the words that the President said. I thought it was really interesting and very clear as well. But I think the fact that you've now got this sense of different formations developing. So, you know, who went to see Zelensky in Kiev recently? It was the Prime Minister of Britain, Keir Starmer, the new Chancellor of Germany, Merz, Macron, and Tusk. Now again, go back a decade, would the Prime Minister of Poland been a part of that quartet? Not so sure. The other day, who was it that came out and really upped the ante in relation to the conduct of Netanyahu's government in Gaza? It was this alliance of Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister of Canada, Starmer again, and Macron. So I think you're going to get and this is, I've just been to the panel on middle powers in a multipolar world. We're going to see all sorts of new alliances developing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, so long as it is not about trying to undermine fundamentally the international institutions that have actually just about held the world together.
But going back to the UK's influence in this world, the UK had two special relationships, or perceived special relationships. One with the US, of course, and one with the Commonwealth. I mentioned India, for instance, as a rising superpower. Where do we stand on that front? And tell us about the UK's weight in Washington now, and could it be a bridge between the EU and the other side of the Atlantic?
Well, I'd love to be able to give a clear answer, but the thing about a bridge is there are two ends to the bridge. And I think in the British mindset, we'd love to think that we did have that. But I think we just have to accept that we're dealing with an American administration that is utterly unpredictable. So I don't know is the answer. That is definitely the purpose of British foreign policy at the moment, is to try to maintain. I thought you were going to see the special relationships with Europe and the United States.
No more.
Interesting. Well, yeah, but I think that's the one that we shouldn't lose. I mean, the Commonwealth, in a way, will take care of itself. And, you know, King Charles has a role to play in that, the government, the Commonwealth summits and so forth. But I think we'll be making a terrible mistake if we fail to understand that relationship with the European Union matters to us, bizarrely, as much as it did when we were part of it. So because we don't have the clout with America. The clout that we had with America was in part because we were the country within the European Union that they felt they could most talk to, lean on, be across our politics. We're now out. So it's harder for the UK now to forge that path as a bridge. And so it's one of those things where I think we probably talk about the special relationship too much, because it feels a bit needy to be talking about it, but at the same time, so we've got to keep those relationships as strong as they can be, mindful of the fact that we have weakened them. That was a decision that we, the British people, took.
Away from geopolitics now for a while anyway. I mentioned in my introduction some of the challenges faced by the world today. I've talked about technological disruption, lots of conversations around AI, the potential destruction of many jobs, and not just. Climate change, you mentioned it, the polarization of the general discourse, the way we talk to each other, the way we interact with each other as well has changed tremendously. So what is, according to you, the most pressing challenge we are facing today, and therefore what the priority should be, and what impact of all this on democracy? I'm talking about AI, climate change, I'm talking about the challenges the world is facing. Which one is the most pressing? All of them all at once?
I love the way you weave about 8 massive questions into one. If we're talking about, and you mentioned there in the whole concept of truth and fact in debate, I think I often talk about what I call the 3 Ps that are driving a lot of the problems that we've got in the moment. populism, polarization, and post-truth. Okay, populism. Trump is the most obvious example. Populism is a form of politics where you see your role as to exploit problems to your advantage rather than to solve the problem. Polarization is a form of politics where, rather than seeing your role as bringing people together, you see it as driving people apart into their tribes, and then hopefully they just sort of fight with each other, and you stay with the winning side and the winning side stays with you. And post-truth is much more than lying. Post-truth is essentially creating a false narrative that your supporters will believe. Putin is not an invasion; it's a special military operation. Zelensky is a Nazi. These are post-truth facts that are created as a way of driving this polarizing narrative. And I think this thing that I've found, part of me says, well, Russia, maybe you wouldn't be too surprised. I've found it genuinely surprising and shocking that we now have, as President of the United States, somebody who is a post-truth president. And AI, by the way, has the capacity to take this to levels that are frankly terrifying. Where you can, because it's happening already, and if we're not careful, if we don't have proper media literacy and our own critical thinking developed. I found myself the other day, I retweeted something that the Pope had said. It was a video of the Pope speaking, and then I retweeted it, and then I was bombarded with people. Why are you doing this? It's fake. So that is going to, and you talked about the impact upon democracy. We're seeing it with elections right around the world. So it's something we've got to be conscious of. Politicians should see their job as trying to challenge it. The problem is, at the moment, we have a generation of politicians who actually see it as more opportune to exploit it.
My previous question was multi-layered because I basically wanted to find out what stops you from sleeping at night. So let's explore truth and this post-truth landscape we evolve in today, because clearly that's very much on your mind. Media was, of course...
No, the thing that keeps me awake at night is climate. Okay. Yeah, but post-truth is part of that. Post-truth is part of that. I honestly think there is going to be a special place in hell for the people who have monetized and weaponized the campaign against net zero and decarbonisation. I really do. And so that is the thing that keeps me, and the man with the orange scarf agrees with me. I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, the gentleman clapping is the former managing director of the World Bank, Bertrand Badret. I very much hope you are going to ask us a question about that later on, Bertrand, and to the rest of the audience as well, of course. Yes, going back to the truth and the role of media, we are seeing this great fragmentation of the media landscape. And truth is now coming at a premium. We all have to pay for our subscription to reputable, credible publications these days. How do you see it evolve going forward? And what will be the pillars, the vectors of truth in this multimedia, multi-platform landscape?
I think it's, well, first of all, I think actually education is fundamental to this. I think it's Finland. In Finland, because they've had the... Are you finished? Somebody's smiling at me. Are you finished? Well, correct me if I'm wrong. Is it true that in Finland now, children in primary school are being taught about how to spot fake news? Yeah, so, and that's because of the experience they've had of living next door to the Russians for so long. So I think that I honestly believe political education is fundamental to this, because I don't know what it is like here, but in the UK, for example, which is meant to be one of the kind of, developed, well-educated democracies, unless you study A-level, which is 16 to 18, politics, you don't learn about politics in school. So where are you getting your politics from? You're getting it from your parents. Well, that might be good, it might not be good. You're getting it from the media. Well, we have a very, very polarised, biased, and a media that often, you mentioned the FT there, is one of the few newspapers that still cares about fact and still cares about the separation of news and comment. So most of the media, that's gone. And then the other thing I would argue is that the reason why education is so fundamental to this is because you're asking as though this is a kind of something that can be fixed quickly. It can't be fixed quickly. It's not going to be fixed by the people who are currently either driving our current media models or exploiting them on this populist political landscape. So I think there's got to be a long-term educative process of actually getting us better at critical thinking. Because otherwise we don't know, once we don't know the difference between fact and fiction, then I don't honestly understand how you hold together a democratic process. And I think that's the path that we're on unless we start to reverse it.
So education to develop fact-checking skills, essential, very important. What about the role of journalism? What about journalists as people able to hold power to account? Is journalism still alive?
Well, it is. There are lots of good journalists in the world, but you know, I mentioned the media model. Just look at the way that, sorry to keep going on about Trump, but he's obviously, you know, front of mind. Although it's actually been really nice here today. Hardly anybody's talked about Trump. I was in Ireland yesterday, day before yesterday, and I did an event. There were 500 people in the room, and I asked them, this was at 6 in the evening, how many people here, put your hand up if you haven't said the words Donald Trump so far today? And 4 hands went up. Everybody else had talked about Trump at some stage. But just look at the way that the media's conducting themselves with him. So he's doing stuff. Let's just take one example, the Qatari plane, okay? So Qatar, it would seem, are giving him a replacement for Air Force One. Now, to my mind, that of itself, as a single fact, is a story that in a previous generation, we'd still be talking about it weeks later. Okay? It now emerges that he then comes out and says, this is a very generous gesture, blah, 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 blah. The Qataris then come out and say, well, hold on a minute, it wasn't that, you know, they asked for it in the first place. So the story changes. But because we've already done the plane story, it kind of goes away. So it's not that there aren't good journalists, but the business model of journalism now is about the assumption that none of us have got an attention span greater than a gnat. And we have to be moving on the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. So there's no space for the sort of coverage of issues that real journalism is meant to represent. And then, of course, the other thing that's happened is that he's turned, you know, I've been to the White House lots of time when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and they have this thing at the top where they bring in the media for a couple of questions at the top of the meeting. He's turned every single one of them into a show, right? So, and they now think they're so interested, whether it was beating up Zelensky or, you know, attacking, showing these fake videos and fake headlines about the Democratic Republic of Congo and confronting the president of South Africa with them and saying, this is happening in your country. And the media doesn't see its role as calling that out. It sees its role as just covering it. Wall to wall, everything he says. I mean, if I see one more time, breaking news, Donald Trump takes questions from reporters, he does it about 6 times a day. And journalism, I think, needs to stand back and say, are we not just being co-opted into this populism, polarizing, post-truth politics? Because they are. And look what Jeff Bezos, you know, one of the richest guys in the world, buys a newspaper as a sort of vanity project and then gives up any sense of kind of editorial integrity. So they're the guys who, you know, journalists I think get a bad press, not least from me quite a lot of the time, but it's the business models that are driving this.
Are you saying that journalism today lacks courage?
Well, look, it's hard to say that when you do have journalists who are currently trying to get into Gaza, are covering Ukraine. So there are a lot of good journalists who do have courage. But I think journalism has changed, and there's not enough of... You talked about speaking truth to power. There are too few journalists now who continue to see that as their role. They see their job is to cover. Somebody once said that politics is showbiz for ugly people, and it's like they're covering. Donald Trump is presenting a reality TV show every day, okay, with different episodes and different characters and different places. And look, it's entertainment. It's politics is entertainment. Boris Johnson did the same with us in the UK, and has left a terrible legacy, which is Brexit. But to my mind, the job of a journalist is not just to say, this is what they're doing, and this is why we think they're doing it. It's actually to have judgment. One of the reasons we got Brexit is because you could find thousands of economists, thousands of historians, thousands of the most clever people in the country who say, this is a very bad idea. And the BBC's idea of journalism was to say, we'll have one saying that, and then we'll have another one saying the opposite. As if you said, and it's the same as saying, right, I mean, today it's either raining or it's not. It's not, I say it is raining and you say it's not. There are certain things called facts. And I think that what journalism is losing is its understanding of the importance of fact in any debate. Sorry, I'm going...
Fair enough, that's what you're here for. And you're still very active, of course, as a journalist, and you recently struck this, well, I think that's called a scoop or an exclusive in our jargon. It's this interview with the new president of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara. What were the highlights? What's your personal key takeaway after that interview?
From al-Shara?
Yeah.
I think, well, he said a lot of interesting things, and he said a lot of the right things. It was obvious to me looking back. So this is the podcast that I do with Rory Stewart, the former Tory cabinet minister, and I bumped into the Syrian foreign minister in Davos and just said, look, you know, we'd love to talk to him, and didn't really think it would happen. But I think what they thought was they'd obviously checked out, or he said he heard the podcast, but lots of people say that. I think they checked it out and they understood it was long form, so you had time to explain stuff. And I think what he was trying to do, because when we talked about getting sanctions lifted, the Americans lifting sanctions, I didn't sense real optimism. But looking back, I think they were just trying to find as many places as possible to get out the message that we're not going to be able to get this place back on the road without getting rid of sanctions. For me personally, the most interesting thing was, because I've been very closely involved in the Northern Ireland peace process, you're always, when you're dealing with people in these situations, so we had a lot of direct discussions with people who either had been or were terrorists in Northern Ireland. And it's the thing that's going in your mind all the time: can somebody really change? That's what I found most interesting. And the truth is, time will tell. Time will tell. But what I saw was somebody who knew that that was the mindset that we were coming in with, and was saying and doing a lot of the right things to project himself in the way that he wanted to. I also thought he had very nice shoes. Yeah. Check out the pictures. He had very, very, very good shoes.
Your podcast, let's talk about it now in greater detail. It's called The Rest is Politics. It's hugely successful at home in the UK, but also internationally. And why do you think that is? Two interesting things about the podcast. Well, the format, podcast, is hugely successful media today. Why? Why do people want to consume content that way, first of all? And the content itself, the fact that you are discussing politics with someone from the opposite end of the political spectrum. Well, not quite conservative. Why do you think it really resonates with people today? Is it the fact that you've created that space where people can kindly and calmly agree to disagree?
Well, I think the motto is disagree agreeably, and I think that is part of it. I think it's, I mean, look, it sounds boastful to say why is it so successful. It's sort of, but I think it speaks to what I was saying earlier about what the media and politics think the public have become. So the media thinks that the public can't cope with complicated arguments. Politics thinks that unless you play the media game, you're not going to win power. And the combined effect has been to kind of shrink debate. One of the reasons I like coming somewhere like this, I mentioned the thing about, I've hardly heard anybody talk about Trump, is because there's a time in our media landscape, it's almost like we can only talk about one thing at a time, when actually the world's very, very complicated. So we try and talk about several things every week. I think the other thing is that people are fed up with being treated like idiots. And so if you watch and I hate attacking the mainstream media, but if you watch the mainstream news, if you turn on the BBC, I mentioned the BBC, but Sky News, ITV, whoever it might be, And so something happens, and they give you a few of the basic facts, and then there's a talking head talking to a talking head about what a third talking head thinks, okay? And 24 News has just become a sort of never-ending talking shop, and I think people have just turned away from it because they're not doing it out of a sort of desire to inform or educate. They're doing it because they've got space to fill. And I think what we do, what I think a podcast can do, is give people a more kind of intimate access to a different way of consuming news. Podcasts are never going to replace the news. But I think what they do is treat people with respect, treat people as intelligent human beings who are capable of listening to something for an hour, and disagree agreeably. We've only had one shouting match during the whole thing. It was actually about Northern Ireland. Rory Stewart said something that really got right into my bones, and I flipped, because I used to flip quite a lot in my pre-podcast days. But I think it's the intimacy. I'm finding it quite strange. I've been very well known in the UK for a long time, and not always terribly popular. And these days, honestly, I was on the tube the other day. In one carriage on the tube, 4 people held up their phones and said, I'm listening to the podcast. I mean, it's weird.
But you just mentioned the word intimacy, and I think that's a very powerful word in today's AI-driven age. That proximity, that humanity. You're very right, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that people want that humanity, that warmth, possibly, and that time too. But we need to wrap up, sadly. I have 2 more personal questions for you before I invite the rest of the room to ask questions, and I will invite you to answer quite quickly, please, even though they are very deep and existential questions here. One is that maybe your advice to young political advisors or journalists here today, possibly some of them in the room, what's the single most important thing they should understand about power and persuasion?
Short answer, strategy is God. It's all about the strategy. So all the stuff, social media, pace of change and all that stuff, it is less important than what your actual strategy is. That is more important than anything else.
And lastly, let's talk about your own journey now that you are in your 60s, if I may.
68.
Mid-60s. You have spoken very openly about your battle with mental health, with reinvention, with remaining relevant in today's world. What still drives you, and do you still have that fire?
Yeah, I do. I mean, in fact, one of the things that still drives me is actually the debate about mental health. Because I've had an amazing life, I've had several really good careers and met some incredible people, and I have a nice time. But I get very, very bad depression from time to time, and I've had breakdowns and all that. And I think it's important that we try to change the dialogue about mental health and mental illness, and so that drives me. The things we've been talking about today drive me, the nature of our politics, the nature of our media landscape, and yeah, I think if you've got a voice, you've got to use it. I think you've got a brain, you've got to use it. So I was 68 at the weekend, and I mean, I can remember when I was a kid, I used to think, God, that's like being dead. But now I feel like 25, so it's all fine.
Okay, very quickly, one question from the audience, so make it good. Anyone? Bertrand.
Since you invited me to raise a question, a few months ago I made a lecture on climate, and people told me at the end, well, what you say is interesting, but climate is no longer fashionable. We should call something different. So what's your advice to make it, I would say, great again, but fashionable again? And because maybe we made mistakes. I mean, the way we saw climate was not perfect, and it's time to reflect on why we are here. So what would be your advice to make it simple?
Okay, I mean, the first thing is, honestly, this is more than just a plug because it's relevant. Listen to the interview on our podcast today with Ed Miliband, Climate Change Secretary, former leader of the Labour Party, because he gives you part of the answer. I think the main thing is to stop being so defensive. That what these guys, the Koch brothers and the populists and the drill baby drill people, what they've done is they've made people like you who know you're on the right side of history, they've made you feel more defensive than I think you should. I'm not saying you personally, but the debate. And so I think it's to stop being defensive, to keep making the argument, to never tire of making the argument, and you make that argument at several levels. You make the economic argument, you make the fresh air, clean water argument, you make the business argument, and above all, you make that historical argument, which I think when you were winning the argument, was around the facts haven't changed. In fact, if anything, the facts have got worse. But if you go back to the kind of Al Gore, Greta, all that stuff going on, all that's changed is the battle of the narrative. And I think what happens is people get so confident and comfortable and complacent when it feels like they're winning the narrative, they don't notice that there are people on the other side who are fighting against it, and you just dismiss them. And hey, guess what? Now they're winning it. So you've got to fight, you've got to refight it and refight it and refight it.
Alastair, huge thanks.
I'm very happy to, because I know this guy was talking, I'm very happy to answer, and I'll hang around for any other questions, don't worry.
But if no one's dying for a question, we're going to have to wrap up. Huh? I am indeed, and unfortunately, I can't see any hands right now. There was one. Quickly, please.
I don't want to ask you some questions that are already so this is something which is not. Why do you think, Republican Party has always been part of Reagan in terms of the relationship to Russia? Now, Donald Trump was a single person with his unique position on Russia. Could you explain to us why the Republican Party and the Republican electorate adopt Donald Trump's position? Because usually the politicians, they want to take the...
I think they're saying they need the room. They're saying they need the room. I've got the question. Look, I am the last person on the earth to be able to answer a question about what goes on inside Donald Trump's mind. I don't know, is the answer. And I know all the theories, and he's got something on him and blah, blah. The reason I don't quite buy that theory is it would have to be something phenomenal that none of us even can comprehend, because he's survived so many things that no other president would have done. So I think it's to do with, I honestly think it's to do with, this is my theory, Trump has completely taken over the Republican Party. The Republican Party as we knew it, Reagan, doesn't exist. He's taken it over, and I think what he wants is a world in which leaders like him, leaders like Xi, leaders like Putin, leaders like Modi, leaders like whoever you want to say, can emerge, get their country, and almost make their country an extension of themselves. An extension, in his case, of the business interests and the... Because I think he's motivated by three things. He's motivated by power, fame, and wealth. And actually, I think the order is fame, wealth, power. I think power is the least interesting of the three to him. But honestly, you'd have to ask somebody who knows him better than I do.
Well,
next event's coming in, I can see them.
Absolutely. Many thanks.
Thank you
please
very
join
much.
me
Thank you.
in thanking Mr. Campbell here for a great conversation.